Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And we're getting close to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization meeting that is going to take place in Vilnius, Lithuania. So we'll have to see what occurs at those meetings, what is the narrative that comes out of Vilnius post-NATO meeting. Again, there is a big push to try and get the Ukrainian state into NATO, either during the conflict, which would essentially launch the Third World War, or sometime after the end of the conflict, which essentially creates an environment in which the conflict would never end. The Russians would have no interest in having any conversations if it knew that Ukraine would be admitted into NATO post-war. So talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. A difficult situation. The U.S. president has spoken about the delivery of 155 millimeter cluster munitions to the Ukrainians. Very interesting information out of the mouth of Joseph Biden. He essentially admitted to what MFAN reported the day before yesterday, that the U.S. was running out of stockpiles of 155 millimeter artillery rounds. So is the U.S. going to start producing more 155 millimeter artillery rounds to backfill both U.S. stockpiles and to continue to support Ukrainian military operations? Well, the short answer is yes. But why is the U.S. having some difficulty in ramping up production? Well, there's a variety of, there's a few companies outside of the big arms contractors that provide and produce 155 millimeter artillery ammunition, howitzer ammunition. Now, one of the issues that this production capacity is facing is the fact that they're also producing other artillery ammunition for the Ukrainians as well. So if you look at what the Ukrainians were using really before the robust support from NATO and the United States started, most of the Ukrainian artillery was obviously Russian Soviet origin, meaning 152 millimeter, 122 millimeter, 130 millimeter rockets and artillery ammunition. The Ukrainians had over 500 of what are referred to 2S1s and 2S3s and 2s, which are self-propelled artillery systems. 2S3, 2S1s. And they essentially had 500 of those self-propelled systems, to include many more towed systems as well. Again, firing Soviet-era 152, 122, 130 millimeter artillery rounds. The Russians very quickly started to destroy those Ukrainian depots and production capacity. And that then created a scenario where the West had to start manufacturing and producing those same Soviet artillery rounds and hand them over to the Ukrainians. This was really before the West started pumping in these 155 millimeter systems, such as the M109, M777, what have you. So U.S. production capacity converted to produce those Soviet-era ammunitions. So they're going to have to create dual lines. They're going to have to create the Ukrainians still use those Soviet era rounds in conjunction with the NATO 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter. They're also producing, meaning the West, Western companies are producing 125 millimeter tank rounds for T-72 variant. That is the most numerous tank the Ukrainians have right now. And obviously, we've seen an influx of Leopard 2s, which fire the Rheinmetall 120 millimeter. We have seen the Challenger 2, although we have not seen them really on the battlefield. Those fire a even different round. It's a rifled 120 millimeter round that is not the standard that you would see on an M1A1 Abrams or a Leopard 2. Then you've got obviously I just talked about the 125 millimeter round. So you have all this ammunition of different size and different fit that needs to be produced and handed over to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians received a lot of T-72 variants from the Poles. And that ammunition, again, is 125 millimeter rounds. And the West is supplying that ammunition to the Ukrainians. So we know that millions of 155 millimeter rounds have been handed over to the Ukrainians. So much so it has depleted U.S. stocks. And what we're hearing here at MFAN is it's significant. The amount of ammunition that the U.S. has supplied has depleted U.S. stockpiles. So much so, it's of concern for U.S. warfighters, top military leadership. They're concerned that because the U.S. has tapped into these stockpiles and sent all this ammunition to the Ukrainians, that if a large war were to erupt between the United States and China or what have you, that the United States would be at a disadvantage in terms of ammunition expenditure, especially at the rate that we're seeing ammunition being expended in this conflict. It's much higher in terms of the firing of heavy artillery than what was anticipated in a high-intensity conflict. And we've talked about this before, going back, we've seen this in World War I, where the use of ammunition of artillery far exceeded initial expectations of what was anticipated to be expended. So again, here in the U.S., you have multiple companies producing multiple lines of ammunition. It's just not 155, right? Again, they're producing 122s, they're producing 130, 152 millimeter in addition to the 155. So not an easy a goal right now for these munitions companies in terms of starting to restockpile these systems for the United States. This vast quantity of ammunition that has been expended in artillery rounds. Again, proxy world war. That seems to be, as we watch what's happening in Lithuania right now, seems to be on the precipice of possibly escalating. Now, we'll have to see what happens and what comes out of Lithuania. But it does appear, at least the military leaders in NATO, understand that the Ukrainians, with what is being handed over to the Ukrainians, are not going to defeat the Russians on their own. They're not going to push the Russians out of lands that they have taken. It is going to be incredibly difficult, even if an air force is handed over to the Ukrainians. And that is what is right now is being articulated to and explained to the NATO political leadership. And that's kind of where we sit. So an important bit of information that I wanted to talk about in terms of the ammunition issue. And it's exactly the same process in terms of what is happening with and why the U.S. is handing over those cluster munitions. It's not an additional capacity. It is not a new capability. The Ukrainians have cluster munitions. The Ukrainians have had cluster munitions. It's just the U.S. is running out of the most preferred type of 155 millimeter artillery round that the Ukrainians like to use. That's the unitary explosive, and then obviously even more so the Excalibur, precision-guided artillery round that enables a one-shot, one-kill on a main battle tank, a battlefield position that they are able to use. And the Russians have similar systems as well. But right now, the Russians are winning the manufacturing conflict. The Russians are not facing dual production lines. They don't have to produce NATO weapon systems. They don't have to produce Soviet-era weapon systems. The West does to feed this Ukrainian war machine. The Russians just produce their standard 152, 122, 130 millimeter artillery round that fits their systems that they have. So they don't have this hodgepodge of weapon systems from M109s, M777s, 2S1s, 2S3s, what have you. They're not dealing with that scenario, which gives them an advantage, production advantage, and a battlefield advantage in terms of logistics as well. So that's where we kind of sit. Obviously, thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.